you. Okay, Paramita, you can start. You can formally start now.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, all of you. Respected
Yes.
Chairperson, Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, Professor Nandini Sahu, distinguished speakers, Professor T.S. Satyanath, sir, and Dr. Anand Prakash, sir, and participants. It is my privilege to welcome you all to this webinar on comparative world literatures held by Hindi University, West Bengal, Howrah. In the words of the great literary critic, Edward said, literature is a way of being in the world. So, today we'll explore how comparative literatures can help us better understand that world and our place within it. This is my great pleasure to introduce Honorable Vice Chancellor, Ma'am of Hindi University, Professor Nandini Sahu, who is a distinguished academician, poet, and creative writer who currently serves as the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University West Bengal. Previously, she was the director of the School of Foreign Languages at IGNOU, New Delhi. A renowned Indian English poet and folklorist, Professor Sahu is a best selling author on Amazon with 21 books to her credit. Her academic excellence is marked by double gold medals in graduation and post graduation. She has received the prestigious Literary Award Gold Medal from the Honorable Vice President of India for her outstanding contribution to English studies. Professor Sahu's accolades include the coveted Michael Madhusudan Academy Award in 2024 and the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2024 as well. As a professor of English, her research interests span a wide range of areas, including new literatures, critical theory, folklore and cultural studies, Hindu studies, Indian knowledge systems, comparative literature, children's literature, and American literature. Her remarkable achievements and contributions to academia have solidified her position as a leading figure in Indian English literature and education. Now, I would like to welcome Honorable Vice Chancellor, Ma'am, Professor Nandini Sahu, for inaugural speech. Professor Nandini Sahu, Ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Paramita, for this elaborate introduction. I don't know where you got it from. Okay, so today's lectures in the University Special Lecture Series. For today, the two distinguished speakers, Professor Satyanath and Professor Anand Prakash. I take it bit of personally today. Well, unlike other lectures, when the speakers were eminent scholars, definitely they were the best brains of the country, no doubt about it. But when it comes to Professor Satyanath and to Professor Anand Prakash, apart from both of them being distinguished scholars in the country, both of them have been my mentors. So I'm humbled and I'm honored to be the host in Hindi University as the Vice Chancellor, to be the host for these two people who have shaped me to be what I am today. And I don't shy away from telling that I have been learning many things from both of them, research and how to orient new scholars into research and then creative writing, whole lot of things. I have 2 decades of history with both of them. So I welcome both Professor Satyanath and Professor Anand Prakash to Hindi University Special Lecture Series on comparative world literatures. Coming to Professor Anand Prakash, I met him in the year 2006 when I came to Delhi as a teacher in IGNOU. And the very year I met him as one of the experts in English department for some seminar, for some lecture, and every other day I used to come across Professor Anand Prakash. And then I kept on meeting him, learning new things from him. And I don't know when I became so comfortable, so close to Professor Anand Prakash, I started sharing my own poetry with him. And in return, he used to share his poetry with me. And we are fellow poets and fellow researchers. And there is not a single publication that I do without having a discussion with Professor Anand Prakash. And he has been one of my admirers and also biggest critics. If he doesn't like anything, he would definitely tell me, I need this part to be removed, this part to be changed. So, whatever I am today, a poet or a creative writer, or even a researcher publishing widely, in everything, Professor Anand Prakash has some or other contribution. And now my new poetry book, Medusa, is coming up this morning. I shared it with him. And in the acknowledgements, he is the first person who I acknowledge, who I thank for, shaping me for what I am today. And sir, welcome to Hindi University Special Lecture Series in this Comparative World Literature program. Dr. Paramita will talk about your contributions to English literature in a much more formal way, but maybe my introduction about you was a bit of emotional, which is obvious, which is, I think, acceptable to everyone. And now coming to Professor Satyanath, I would talk about Professor Satyanath as one of the biggest folklorists the world has produced. You would just Google folk literature and you will find his name everywhere. Uh, Whenever we start talking about folklore, he comes to my mind. Like in any lecture, I refer to him, his work on folklore, especially this chapter on Panchatantra that he contributed to our MA program, MA in folklore and culture studies, where he talks about scriptocentric, phonocentric, and body-centric approaches to folklore. I'm sure today, somewhere or other, these references will come up in his lecture. He is very scholarly. He prepares very thoroughly. If you give him some work, a lecture or anything, he prepares seriously. And I think his preparations and the group of folklorists that he has produced in the country, I belong to that group. And when I designed my MA in folklore and culture studies, he referred many important scholars of folk literature to me who have also substantially contributed to folk literature. And there is no folklore research in the country without Professor Satyanath. Even I would not shy away from telling that. And personally, I am very fond of him. And he is a very, very dear friend. Whenever I meet him, my heart is so full of joy. Today, I'm so glad to see both of them sitting in front of me and being the guests of Hindi University. And for their reference, let me put it on record here that Sir Professor Satyanath and Professor Anand Prakash, I would like to inform both of you that Hindi University is a language university. Just now, Professor Satyanath was telling that folklore is deliberately kept out from world literature scenario and discussions. Yes, I agree to that. And we compartmentalize. We talk about one language as if it is a predator to another language, but it's actually not so. Languages are like sisters, they are like rivers, they flow into each other. So, keeping that in mind, in Hindi University, we do extensive research and lot of work on courses on languages of the world. We are introducing a comparative world literatures department. I think there is no other department in the country which is named as comparative world literatures. There are comparative literature departments, but comparative world literatures department is a very innovative idea from Hindi University West Bengal, where we would be introducing 22 MA programs on the 22 languages approved by the Constitution of India. Apart from that, we would be introducing MA in folk literature, where we will need help from Professor Satyanath. And when it comes to the other 22 languages, we will need the help of Professor Anand Prakash and Professor Satyanath as well. And we are going to have at least 6 MA courses on the foreign languages and many foreign languages that I would inform you one by one. And this lecture series is a preliminary homework to that department, comparative world literatures. We invite the best brains in the country, as I already told you, and no doubt both of you are experts in your own respective fields. And today, the way we are waiting for you to contribute, to tell us what is comparative world literature and how the literatures, the languages, and even folklore in case of Professor Satyanath, how they can be a part of comparative world literature department. And with this, I will stop here, and I would suggest that Paramita may kindly introduce both the speakers formally for the listeners. Yes, Paramita?
Thank you, ma'am. Now, I would say it is my great privilege to introduce Professor T.S. Satyanath sir. Professor T.S. Satyanath sir is a distinguished scholar and former professor in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies at the University of Delhi. His research interests span comparative literature, translation studies, cultural studies, and folklore studies, with an extensive publication record in these fields. A seasoned academic, Professor Satyanath has held visiting scholar positions at the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the University of Georgetown, Guyana. He has also served as a visiting professor at Kannada University, Hampi. Professor Satyanath is closely affiliated with the Delhi Comparatists, a vibrant community of scholars and students dedicated to comparative studies on the University of Delhi campus. His outstanding contribution to scholarship have been recognized with several prestigious awards, including the Karnataka State Janapada and Yakshagana Academy Award, the Sham Ba Joshi Award, and the Professor G.S. Shivaru Drappa Award. Now, without any delay, Professor Satyanath sir for his enlightening speech. Professor Satyanath sir.
Thank you very much. It's a matter of pleasure to be here, particularly the work that is spearheaded by Professor Nandini Sahu. By mistake, if I call her by the first name, forgive me. We are friends for a very long time, and it's extremely difficult to adhere to formalities in our conversation.
Please call me Nandini.
So, secondly, I think, together we have worked out on several folklore projects, and I hope this is the beginning of something different, linking literature and folklore together into academia. The third thing is I'm extremely thankful to her and to the university for asking me to speak on this subject. I just wanted to speak on gender and genre in South Asian traditions, keeping folklore in center, a talk which I had given about a year back, and I wanted to go further deep into it. But because Nandini suggested that I should speak something on folklore and try to bring it into the arena of world literature, I have tried it. I don't think I have done a very commendable job, but anyhow, let us see. This is only a beginning of several other things that is possible. My talk is on comparative folklore in the context of world literature. I have a brief overview. I will have few introductory remarks. Then I will talk of world systems and world literature. Then I will talk of a model, particularly the iconography of Hariti from Gandhara, which belongs to one of the earliest world systems. And this takes us to Panchatantra as a text of world literature. And then I will end up with a brief discussion towards the end. The terms world literature, comparative literature, folklore, and translation have emerged in the context of nation states, colonialism, and globalization. These and other concepts of modernism emerged within the context of monolingually constituted nation states of Europe. Making use of a binary opposition as a methodological tool in which self was always positive and the other negative, colonial vernacular literatures were compared with European literatures as an outcome of influence. Not only Indian poets were described as the Desi counterparts of renowned English poets, for example, Kalidasa is Shakespeare of India, but also studies involving East-West comparisons were undertaken. Here is an image of by a Kannada painter. He's a cartoonist, Naidu, Kalidasa Shakespeare. This is for the volume which Balurao edited in 1966, which is actually Shakespeare in Kannada. Shakespeare Namaskara. Balurao was the editor of Indian literature long back. And this is for Adirangacharya's article, Shakespeare of Ordinary People. Terms like literature, comparative literature, world literature, and folklore have a complex and continually evolving history. The earliest use of the term literature does not go beyond the 15th century. It evolved from the Latin literatura, meaning writing, grammar, and learning, not literature. The first recorded use of comparative literature is from French in 1816 by Michel Noël, and Matthew Arnold, in his inaugural lecture at Oxford University in 1857, used the English term comparative literature. Similarly, word literature was used for the first time in 1827 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in German, referring to the increasing circulation of literatures beyond the national boundaries. The term folklore was first used in 1846 by William John Pons, though its German equivalent used by Grimm brothers dates back to 1812. Hence, the emergence of the terms under discussion took place in Europe within a span of 15 years during the early part of the 19th century. It's also during the 19th century that the nation states came into existence. European expansionism and globalization, tucked with missionary activity and proselytism, triggered translation and print culture facilitated expansion of comparative literature, world literature, and folklore studies to the colonies. In such a globalization perspective, the study of folklore shares a similar features of form, expression, mode, context, meaning, and message of literary studies, whether it is comparative literature or world literature or translation. Hence, it is necessary to problematize these disciplines from the point of view of world systems and globalization. World system and globalization have facilitated the circulation of people, material culture, and ideas, leading to archives that prompts comparative studies of literature, arts, and architecture. Both the birth of comparative studies has been generally believed to have started as an outcome of European expansionism, Enlightenment, and colonization, a Eurocentric view that a part of modernist agenda of privileging Europe while denigrating other cultures. Hence, it will be interesting to explore how Eurasia, with a long-standing intracontinental contact, could throw a new light with regard to the circulation of ideas within the early world system and its globalization. I'm only trying to push back before the colonial contact. Walter Steen started a discussion of revolutionary ideas about the modern world system that has subsequently led to a series of debates on the history of globalization. Equally seminal are the ideas in Janet Abu Lugut's arguments, who contest such a position and proposes an alternative world system before the European domination. Pichard argues that during the Iron Age, a new world system, a single Afro-Eurasian system, developed encompassing trade of luxury goods and agricultural products that was not only hierarchical, but also economic and political in nature. Continuing the discussion on world systems further, Grin and Karatev argue for positing an earlier phase of the Afro-Eurasian world system, which was initiated by the settled agrarian communities along the Nile Delta in Egypt, that subsequently led to the growth of a trade network and eventually resulted in a uniform social development and material culture. Through a further fine-tuning of several early phases development, Grin and Karatev suggest a phase of continental links spanning between 490 BCE and 1492 CE, which was characterized by the rise of empires and the first developed states with a final phase of the agrarian production principle. This is the map showing the details of the Eurasian system. It starts from northern part of Africa, and there are colored centers. There are systems, subsystems, and the arrows indicate the movement of the trade movements within the system. But this is not just a simple trade in itself. This is the figure table, which provides typology of spatial and temporal distribution of the early world system. The top two doesn't come within the purview of world system at all. The next two are the ones that I just mentioned just now. And the fifth and seventh one are the one that Walter Steen mentioned. And then we have the most recent one, which is called the planetary link. So the two maps here, the one to the left shows the 13th century world system, circulations by Janet Abulgur. She identifies 8 systems showed by different colors. And this whole of Afro-Eurasia that we are talking of will come within it. And it's a part of the Silk Route or Silk Roads. The central red dot that is there is, I have superimposed, that is Gandhara, which is the epicenter of this entire system, and about which we are going to discuss in detail today. The right side figure shows the extent of the Kushan Empire and the location of Gandhara in the center. World systems tend to transform into syncretic publics of pluralistic social epistemology. Hence, we need to understand the pluralistic social epistemology of the world system and the model that operated behind it. Scholars of literary studies have viewed several early world systems as cosmopolis and have even named them using linguistic categories such as Sanskrit cosmopolis, Persian cosmopolis, etc. They are all single monolingual. They are not pluralistic. This is something that we need to note. Let us take a look at Gandhara around the beginning of the Christian era. Gandhara had the unique advantage of being at the center of the Afro-Eurasian world system. I pointed it out already. It was home of multiple religions, languages and script. Aramaic, Greek, Kharosthi and Brahmi were there. Buddhism entered Gandhara around 3rd century BCE. That is where the discussion of the world system that we are doing. At a time when the region was engaging as a thriving center of trade, connecting people from Egyptian, Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Hellenistic, and Phoenician regional spheres. Empire, it not only was an empire of confluence of faith, languages, scripts, and cultures, but also accommodated them and created an atmosphere for the sustenance of its diversity. Consequently, Gandhara created an ideal atmosphere in which both cosmopolitan and vernacular cultures could sustain themselves. Obviously, as a public of pluralistic social epistemology, the model for comparative folklore that we are looking for could as well be present in the representational formats of Gandhara. Historians have noted that the outbreak of the Antonine plague during 165-180 CE coincided with the earliest representation of a Buddhist female deity called Hariti in Gandhara. The epidemic has been claimed to have reached pandemic levels, proportions within Gandhara and subsequently traveled to the Mediterranean region along with Alexander. Hence, Hariti was probably a well-known deity within the Afro-Eurasian world system around the turn of the Christian era. Though Hariti was an ogress from the pre-Buddhist times, had a folk origin. I mean, I'm coming to that. I'm bringing folk here. And used to steal children. She was transformed into a beneficent protector of children and became the goddess to be located at the entrance of the Buddhist monasteries. With the expansion of Buddhism, as the goddess associated with health and illness, her worship gradually diffused into South Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. The three representations of that, the first one to the left is from Donghong, the second one is from Japan, and the third one is from the Java. We also, I mean, this is, this is an isoglass. We can now here take a look at the silk routes and how Taxila, this is the Gandhara region, and then the other parts of the world, Afro-Eurasian worlds are connected. As the goddess, smallpox is one of the, you see, the route, the picture shows the beginning of the smallpox somewhere in Egypt around 1500 BC, and then it gets distributed over the entire region over a period of time. That shows while it is the Hariti, the trade, or the disease, they are all moving within a specific sphere. This is the actually journey of smallpox across time and space. This is the first column shows the time, and then the place where it was noticed, then the continent and the cause. Either it is the trade or war along the Silk Road that has resulted in the distribution of the disease. A sculpture of Hariti from the Kushan period, depicted in Gandhara style from 2nd to 3rd century CE period, and located at the British Museum in London, provides an ideal model for understanding the type of multilinguality and multiculturality that existed in Gandhara. Furthermore, it demonstrates the implications of such a pluralistic social epistemology in the emergence of the Sanskritic and vernacular cosmopolitan writing cultures along the Silk Roads. Ahuja, in his paper One Mother, Many Mother Tongues, takes a look at the above-mentioned sculpture of Hariti to reconstruct the social epistemology that has gone into the details of her iconography. He identifies the children depicted around Hariti as coming from the mythology of 6 different trading communities that were located in Gandhara. The figure shows that before that I will mention them. The Hindu gods Skanda Kartikeya, the Zoroastrian twins Amurdad and Hordad, the Egyptian child goddess Harpocrates, probably the Hellenistic twin Dioscuri, and probably the Phoenician Cyprus temple boy, and the child in her lap or hand is her own, either Priyankara or Pingala. The Hariti revealing these things is here. This is the Hindu gods Skanda Kartikeya. These are the Zoroastrian twins. Phoenician Cyprus boy is in the center. Hellenistic twin Dioscuris are here at the bottom, and the Egyptian child god Harpocrates is here, and the Priyankara or Pingala is on her lap. And these are the close-ups of that. There is, he's holding a peacock, so he has been identified as Skanda, and then the Zoroastrian Amurdad and Hordad are here, and that's how I will skip. And here is this temple boy. These are the Hellenistic Dioscuris, and this is the Phoenician or Cyprus temple boy. Ahuja makes 3 important points regarding the implication of incorporation of deities from multiple trading communities into Hariti's iconography. Rejection of the possibility of hybridity, recognition of marginality, and universalization. This is important. Universalization processes like globalization and cosmopolitanism need not necessarily have to be homogenizing ones. They can still support diversity. Thus, we can see the Silk Roads as a world system, facilitated circulation of a variety of things, trade, religion, disease, culture, etc. Mayer, in 1988, 89 is another paper, Painting and Performance, Picture Recitation and its Indian Genesis, posits an alternative trajectory and traces the global development over 1,000 years of genre of a popular Buddhist folk literature from China by pointing out that the early Chinese literature, conspicuous by the absence of animal tales, appears to have incorporated the animal-centered stories in prosemic format, which is Pain Vain There, which is a mixture of prose and verse, what we call champu in Sanskrit, due to the impact of picture showman traditions from India. In fact, the Chinese tales are conspicuously anthropomorphic nature and in all probability could not have created animal-centered stories, a characteristic of Panchatantra. It is highly probable that the performance of Buddhist picture showman traditions, narratives similar to the present day's Patuas, Bhopas, and Manipas, who traveled along with the trade caravans along the Silk Roads, might have played an instrumental role not only in the diffusion of the performative form, but also in its format. This takes us to the circulation of Panchatantra stories, which have been studied more as a literary text rather than folklore. I have to skim very fast here. Panchatantra, I can't provide all the information that I have. Panchatantra has been generally considered as a single text written in Sanskrit and went into different languages. But however, interestingly, Panchatantra has two traditions, a Vishnu Sharma tradition and a Vasubhaga tradition. One of them is a Brahminical, Vasubhaga is a Jain. So there are two. In addition to that, there are also Buddhist, tribal, and a variety of other and non-Indian traditions have adopted it. It is available in the classical, popular, folk, and tribal formats. It has literary, oral, sculptural, painted, and performative representations. And then it has a very complex social epistemology. It has language as one of the dimensions. It has region as one of the things, religion as another, caste as another basis, Indian, non-Indian as another basis, and gender. So on a variety of social epistemologies, it varies. But interestingly, the earliest example of Panchatantra goes not exactly to Panchatantra of the 2nd century. It goes back to Lothal, Indus Valley civilization. Panchvani and Sons, this is the episode of the crow and a deer. Crow puts pebbles into the pitcher and makes it come up, and the deer is in awe, seeing the intelligence of that. There is also another one of the fox and the crow story, which is to the right side of the image. So they go. I'm not going to. Despite all this diversity, Panchatantra was perceived to have been from a single origin, a Vishnu Sharma Panchatantra. This is Edgar's, he uses a tree model. This is Edgerton's reconstruction of 1924. So hence, rather than treating all versions of Panchatantra as having been derived from an Ur text, which is a single text, implying a tree model, as we see in Edgerton here, they could be treated as a pluralistic social epistemology, multiple works. So we will briefly go through that. I'll just skim so that I will save some time. Two textual traditions, Vishnu Sharma and Vasubhaga, a Jain and a Brahminical. Transmediality, this is what Professor Sahu mentioned, scriptocentric writing system, phonocentric oral system, and the body-centric painting, sculpture, and performance. In most cultures, that means most culture that we come across, the Panchatantra stories, they are available in multiple formats. Interestingly, Sculptural versions predate textual versions, suggesting that it's probably the oral or the performative versions which went outside India even before the textual versions were created in that language. So, it is a very problematic issue, and, let's no, I think have I made a mistake? Okay, anyhow, let me go. Transmit. Then secondly, this Panchatantra stories getting into Jataka stories and becomes a part of the Buddhist canon. That means they become Jataka stories of the animal symbolism. And then all stories of localization will be converted into folklore. The Panchatantra of Vishnu Sharman was first translated into Pahlavi. And then, it took a route. So let us look at the bottom. Pahlavi to Syriac, Arabic, then Hebrew, European, then into print culture, and further into the other thing. The Silk Road translations and adaptations follow a trajectory: Chinese, Tibetan, Japanese, and then, around. This is the textual version. Then you have Sogdian paintings from 6th century CE. These are only visuals. And then you have the Jataka stories coming from popular level, originally from folk, but moved into popular level and then into Jataka stories. In South India, something interesting happened. South Indian versions went to Southeast Asia. It is not the Vishnu Sharma edition which goes to Southeast Asia. It is the Vasubhaga tradition, which is a Jain tradition. Accordingly, the first text that is available in the Vishnu Sharma tradition is 1191 from Kashmir. The first Vasubhaga tradition available is from 1031 CE. It's in Kannada Panchatantra by Durga Simha. Around 1200, you have a Tamil and a Sanskrit Tantrakhyana. This is before 1200. And then in Java, you have 3 of them available, which is called the Tantri group. Again, Tantri derived from Tantra, Panchatantra. Tantri Kamandaka, Tantri Kediri, and Tantri Demung. Around 1507, we have another Lao Panchatantra available from the Nandaka, called the Nandaka Prakarana. And then in Thailand, you have Nang Tantri, you have another one. In all these, you also have the oral and the visual versions. In both South India and Southeast Asia, sculptural representation predate textual version. The Arabic version, Khalila wa Dimna, also traveled to Southeast Asia in the 17th century, although it was translated around 5th, 6th century. And a certain element from it appears to have entered into the oral and performative traditions of Panchatantra in Java. The reconceptualizations of Panchatantra attempted here bring together an overlapping of sectarian, sub-regional, and medieval political and trade links into focus in the mapping of understanding of textual, oral, visual, and translation traditions. Hence, the comparison that is being made at the national levels in comparative literature and many disciplines actually needs to be reformulated into a comparison of local communities involving the political dynasties, their patronage to poets and artisans, and the trade contacts. If we undertake comparison of sculptural and painting representations of Panchatantra tales from India and other places, the Persian and Arabic illuminated manuscript from Middle East, Sogdian painting from Central Asia, sculptures from Southeast Asia and India, and look at them from the perspective of these locations, then the significance of a marginocentric perspective as a methodology of comparative literary and folklore studies become evident. It not only reverses the trajectory of center-margin relationship that we notice in the early comparative studies, but also brings in the dimension of spatiality into the study of Panchatantra and its translation. These links themselves can constitute a network resulting in a constellation of texts, a model that is generated by the archive of texts and their relationships. It is interesting to point out that though Panchatantra has been pointed out to be a Hindu text, its movement could be, its movement has resulted in its stories being translated into Buddhist, Jain, Zoroastrian, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish public spheres. Accordingly, changes and transformation, if there are any, need to be mapped. This takes us to spatiality of Panchatantra. There is a need to blur the spatiality emerging from the area studies and resulting in the construction of imagined national and regional literary and folk cultures. Folklore is also an identity issue now, which we should actually reduce that. Instead, we can go for specific and local traditions that are redefined in terms of their own medieval cultural categories. Thus, the medieval trade routes, cutting across multilingualities and creating multicultural corridors, provide an appropriate model to understand circulation, whether it is material culture or literary culture. Taking a cue from the openness and the freedom that we notice within the Afro-Eurasian world system, whether it is material culture or representation or ideas, I have attempted to follow medieval trade routes to understand the diffusion of Panchatantra. Interestingly, it is the trade routes themselves that provide the model of a constellational network of comparative literary studies, translation studies, and folklore studies. The immense reception to Panchatantra in terms of a high degree of translation and multimedial representations could as well be due to the inherent multicultural receptivity that is characteristic of the Afro-Eurasian world system in which it operated. The very fact that reception to the stories is at folk, popular, and elite levels suggests that these stories permeated into all the three public spheres. Figure below schematically represents the Panchatantra's literary world system. This is the image of a great bear. I have a small comment. I cannot go into detail. Which they call Ursa Major or Ursula Major. An immediate model for the conceptualization of pluralistic social epistemology of Panchatantra in the Afro-Eurasian literary system could be found in the concept of a constellation. A constellation is an area on the celestial sphere in which a group of stars get conceived in terms of imaginary, I highlight imaginary shape. It is important to note that the outline or pattern that we notice is not a reality but an imaginary one. For example, the constellation of Ursula Major is perceived variously as Great Bear, Europe, Saptarshi Mandala, V in India. It is also perceived as a wagon, plow, etc. by different cultures. So this is where. So the model that we have been talking of is here. The Panchatantra is in the center, in the left portion of the figure. Silk roads and Central Asia, then spice roads in Middle East and Europe, sea routes, Southeast Asia and East Asia. Now this looks like a constellation. This constellation is actually derived from the figure at the top, which is Janet Abulugod's one, which shows that it is these multiple subsystems of the world, 13th century world system, yielding it. And what we get is actually in the bottom figure, it's a network of, this is not a uniformly distributed like water. This is actually a archipelago model in which there are islands or the centers of creative activity or the cultural activity, and they get connected by the type of model that I have been talking of. Thus, Silk Roads was neither exclusively a silk trading route, nor was it a single route. It was a network of routes covering the entire Afro-Eurasian region. It neither had a center nor margins. At best, it could be perceived as a constellation. I'll be done in few things, four or five slides. The multilingualism and the multiculturalism that we noticed in the Afro-Eurasian system at Gandhara and the multicultural representation and translation activity that we see with regard to Panchatantra prompt us to think about alternative ways of doing comparative literature, world literature, and folklore study. This world system is a system of shared pluralistic social epistemology and truly cosmopolitan in nature. One of the important issues that this talk attempts is to decenter the centrality that printed literary text has been given in the literary studies during the post-print age. Afro-Eurasian communities traditionally use intermediate models of representation and accordingly use composite representational strategies to suit the overlapping nature of the publics that they have to cater. In fact, the links between the circles in the figure could also be understood as multicultural corridors. The trade route themselves were multicultural corridors, the channels through which the circulation of ideas took place. In addition, there are multiple margins with different subsystems and in turn create the possibility of interaction and contestation within and beyond the subsystems. Thus, the world system model of pluralistic social epistemology not only advocates pluralistic ways of comparison, but also is inclusive and accommodative that eventually leads to the emergences of new types of comparison and interdisciplinarity. It is in this nature of the archives that their uniqueness lays, that are not only multiple in nature, but also located at the margins and in vernacular and spoken languages. These archives, conspicuously from folklore and are located at the margins and are multilingual, multicultural, and intermediate, and provide a denser cultural archive that could radically transform comparative folklore studies and world literature. Thank you. I'm done.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I can.
Yes, I would like to request Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, for her beautiful and very, yes, ma'am.
No, fine. complete what you were saying.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We would like to hear the valuable remarks from you.
Right. So before Professor Anand Prakash speaks, maybe I will just take a couple of minutes to give my remarks on what Professor Satyanath spoke. It was a very, very interesting and well-researched paper as expected from Professor Satyanath. Nothing less would have been expected from him. So, sir, you talked about the various Panchatantra traditions and the oral and performative traditions, and then the importance of silk roots, sea roots, and spice roots in comparative world literature, and a lot more than what we can actually explain in a couple of minutes. And I'm going to share, I will request you to give your PowerPoint presentation to me so that I can share it with our faculty if you allow. They can read, and then when we introduce the folklore department, we would be in a position to take some of your ideas with your permission and then invite you as an expert to help us to design our syllabus. My takeaway from today's lecture that you delivered, I have just jotted down a few points. I will quickly go through them. One of your ideas was colonialism and colonization of folk traditions, where comparative world literature that has been shaped by colonial epistemologists, where European scholars, they have classified, translated, and they have appropriated. That was the emphasis. They have appropriated non-European oral traditions, and this colonization process, it privileged over the written over the oral traditions, and it distorted the indigenous narratives to fit Western literary categories. The colonial project also fragmented folk traditions by assigning them some fixed meanings, erasing their fluid and evolving nature. And you talked about the fluidity of folk literature, comparative world folk literature, and that was my takeaway from your lecture. If you agree with this point that I is discussed now. And the other point that I have taken from your lecture is the nation state and the erasure of folk plurality. The rise of the nation states in the 19th and 20th centuries that led to the strategic use of folk literature to construct the national identities was something that you emphasized. Folk traditions did not align with dominant national narratives that were marginalized, while others were treated as authentic representations of the national cultures. And this process ignored regional variations. They suppressed the minority voices and they erased folk traditions that challenged the state non-sponsored and sponsored historiographies. You hinted upon the historiographies, and I took down that point. I would discuss that with you in detail when we talk. And then somehow I thought you also mentioned the missing alternative world folk systems. When we say about the alternatives, we also talk about the missing alternatives. And the comparative studies that often privilege Eurocentric and structured folklore classifications, they sideline the alternative knowledge systems like indigenous Asian, African, and other folk traditions, oral traditions that do not conform to the Western notions of folklore. And we will take this as one of our blocks or units when we design our syllabus. And then something that was very interesting when you mentioned agriculture and folk, the forgotten nexus. Agricultural practices, they have deeply influenced our folk traditions, yet our comparative folklore studies have largely ignored agrarian epistemologies. And probably in your paper you indicated that agricultural folk folk tales through rituals in our ritual, they reflected in our folklore research. Thought you emphasized that the Greek roots and then the sea roots and the spice roots, you repeat all of them. The silk roots again, Amitabh Ghosh talks about the sea roots and the spice roots in his literature. And somehow I found a parallel between your research and the kind of anthropological research and novels that he writes. And you mentioned that the silk routes were not just trade routes, but they were cultural conduits, and they facilitate our research. And then towards the end of your lecture, you mentioned about globalization and the commodification of cosmopolitan folklore. This is very, very important. You are truly folk inspired, and definitely creating new scholars like us who are also folk inspired and inspired by folklore research. And then somewhere you mentioned religion, culture, and the selective preservation of folk traditions. So when we design our course, MA in folk literature, we will take up religion, how religious institutions have played a dual role in folk traditions, sometimes preserving them and sometimes sanitizing, sometimes erasing some elements that do not fit within the dominant religious discourses. So we will think about all these things when we design our folk literature MA program. And to conclude about your lecture, probably we can also think about some decolonized, intersectional, sectional, and ecological rooted approaches to redefine folk literature, and we can ensure that folk literature remains an inclusive, critical, and evolving discipline rather than a static and archaic and curated folk tradition. Your lecture was very, very inspiring. We have taken down all the points, we have recorded it. Of my collaboration, our collaboration with you vis-a-vis folk literature, we will look forward to working with you in future. Thank you so much. And now I welcome the eminent speaker, scholar, poet, Professor Anand Prakash, and I request Dr. Paramita to formally introduce him so that our participants will know him in a more in a structured way. Paramita, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Continuing the knowledgeable discussion further, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Anand Prakash, sir. Dr. Anand Prakash is a distinguished scholar and retired academician who taught English literature at Hansraj College, University of Delhi until his retirement in 2007. He holds a PhD in English literature and has published extensively on literary theory, trends, and criticism. His notable publications include Wuthering Heights and Interpretation from Academic Foundation, New Delhi, Mukti Bodh in Our Time, co-authored with Dr. Richa Bajaj from Lok Mitra Delhi, and Text and Performance, a Theoretical View, co-authored with Dr. Payal Nagpal from Macmillan, New Delhi. Additionally, he has published collections of his creative writing, including Anopcharik, a bilingual miscellany from Sainer, New Delhi, and a collection of his English poems, A World Above Telling, from Signorina, New Delhi. His collections of essays in Hindi, Sanskritic Nibandh, and Itihas or Anya Nibandh from Saina, New Delhi are also notable contributions. Dr. Prakash has also had editorial experience, having edited prestigious journals such as the Journal of Drama Studies and the Journal of Literary Studies. Throughout his career, his academic and literary contributions have significantly enriched the field of English literature, continuing to inspire scholars and readers alike. Now, I would like to request Dr. Anand Prakash, sir, for his insightful speech. Dr. Anand Prakash, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Paramita. And in the beginning, I say a few things about Professor Nandini Sahu, the VC of this university. She's a visionary and a dreamer, and she always has many inspiring plans up her sleeve before she begins, her career at a new place. And I wish her well for that, because that is what academicians and poets and writers in our country should be doing. I'm really overwhelmed by the praise that she showered on me, and I thank her profusely for this. So far as this very erudite lecture by Professor Satyanath is concerned, I'm really educated. I feel, it's a very informative lecture, and there are many points that he has given regarding not just world literature in general, but also the folklore. And he has been able to, convince us that this area of world literature as well as folklore is a very dynamic area, and that people are never static; they're always on the move intellectually and geographically. So I'm truly educated and informed by his erudite presentation. Uh, so far as the point made by Professor Nandini is concerned regarding folklore being an integral part of literature, I entirely agree with her that it's a kind of literature that in fact sits at the back of the written world. People started producing literature much before the literature was written in the form that we have today with us, where the words are frozen. But so far as folklore is concerned, the words are never frozen. They were always enacted, and through enactment, they get new energy and a new force for different audiences to, inform. So this is a very welcome area for us, all of us. And I say that so far as my paper is concerned, it will be about literature, and it will draw rather, heavily from English writing, English history. And I plan to, talk in simple general terms so that, people like me among the audience also make sense of the points that I make. And I say this in the beginning itself, that there is a question that, and I'll be, in fact, raising questions and not answering them. I want all of us together to answer those questions. Let us carry back those questions with us, and then we mull over them, we think about them, and then we reach very working and open-ended conclusions. So that's my offer so far as ideas are concerned. And I start with the questions right in the beginning itself. Isn't writing in different languages and countries that collectively may be called world literature? Most of us think so. That you have your knowledge of French literature, you have knowledge of English literature, you have knowledge of Chinese literature, Japanese literature, Indian literature, African literature, and if you put them together, it becomes world literature. This is the kind of view that most of us present. Then uh, this I call the comprehensive view of the world literature. That you collect things from, glean things from different societies, and you put them together. And since those societies constitute the world, therefore, whatever they say in these respective fields is together making sense as world literature. This is the definition that most of us have in mind. And I would like to contest it. First, try to understand what it means, and then I'll make my own point. So, for instance, translation is at the basis of world literature in that sense, because I don't know Chinese, I don't know Japanese, I don't know French, but then these literatures are available to me in English or my Indian languages. So, because I know about England, because I know about France, because I know about Japan, therefore, I think that I'm in touch with, world literature. This is the kind of understanding that most of us have. We inherit this from our knowledge, from our readings, and we add to it in a sense, that my language in which I write, that language approaches other languages through translation. So this is what, and the second thing that I say is that there is a kind of universalism in literature itself. Plato still appeals to us. Aristotle gives us still ideas. Shakespeare is always, there with us in the form in which we make sense of him. But he lived in a different period. He lived also in a different country, and he himself was not a university person, not a university genius. He came from the street. He came from the masses, and there, he got the energy to experiment, to create, to reproduce human experiences, and they were so intense in their quality that they appeal to all of us. So, and Shakespeare, who was there 400 or so, more than 400 years ago, and he was active in the field of drama and in the field of poetry. Therefore, we say that since he appeals to us, he's a part of world literature. The same thing can be said about Professor Satyanath talked about Panchatantra. So Panchatantra were written way back in the ancient India, but they still make sense to us, and therefore they also are a part of human, culture, and it is so vast and so generously provided. So this is one point regarding thing. I believe that the world had been, if not composite, at least interconnected even at that time when those different literatures were written. Through Professor Satyanath has talked about travels, talked about wanderings, talked about different languages. And you know that the world was not static, as I said. The world was all the time moving in certain direction, and the direction was perhaps integration. This is what the point of view is. Now, my own take on world literature is that whatever has been written in the world may be called world literature, but it can also be questioned. Because world literature for me is a category that is the same as in the case of modernity, that you start thinking about world literature only in the 19th century, or maybe in the 18th and 17th centuries, and there are certain dates that make the idea relate to us in that sense, because when you think of that very important development in European history, Renaissance. Now, that's an idea that takes us very close to our own selves and the Renaissance thought. Before the Renaissance, where were we? I think India, at some level, at political top level, may have been in touch with whatever went on at that time in England, but we were totally separated from that world, and it wasn't available to us. But come Renaissance, and we free ourselves from the medievalism, as I call it, that there's a kind of orthodoxy, and then there's a kind of stasis, then intellectual stasis, cultural stasis, and people just don't know where to look. I don't think in England, from 12th century onwards up to the 16th century, much valuable has been written, just because it was in the grip of medievalism. It was in the grip of preachers. It was in the grip of people who worshipped. It was in the grip of people who believed in a kind of orthodoxy, and therefore they didn't believe in literature. In fact, some of the earliest writings during the Renaissance period were called, morality plays or miracle plays, and they were confined to either the moral principles that were entrenched at that time, or they were miracle plays which were like our Lord Krishna here. Then certain miracles were associated with those religious or historical figures, and those miracles were being retold in a different manner by writers at that time. So that was then, and then comes Renaissance. And Renaissance, when it comes, it changes the mental outlook of first England, Italy, England, France, and then of the whole world. Because Renaissance is something that is a very crucial kind of development in human history. Before Renaissance, at least in Europe, you don't have any reference to the body. You don't have any reference to freedom. You do not have any reference to experimentation. There are a few lights at that time. Chaucer, for instance, is there in the 14th century, and he is there to shake us up and tell us that we should not be completely stuck to the entrenched ideas, and we should try to experiment. And therefore, he uses humor. Now, humor is something that is very, very dangerous for us to adopt. And Chaucer is all the time talking tongue in cheek, and that is what he calls literature. But what kind of literature is it? I think Chaucer, at that point of time, talks about a humanity which survives on the strength of its own resources. It doesn't survive because somebody created it. There was a power that created, and then human beings, were walking around across the globe. That may have been there, but Chaucer tells us that these are the ordinary people, and they are with us, and they will, tease us, and they will excite us, and they will disagree with us, and they will fight with us, and we will fight with them. So in that lies the fun, believes Chaucer in the 14th century itself. But after Chaucer, I don't see there are many people in English literature who would appeal to us in the sense in which, for instance, the 17th century writers in England will start doing. Then straight after that, you have a few sonneteers in the 16th century, and then you have Shakespeare. And Shakespeare doesn't come alone. He comes with a horde of other writers, and he's competing with the university wits, those people who were groomed in Latin, and who are talking about Greek also. But Shakespeare had to learn his own Greek and Latin afresh, and his learning of Greek and Latin was actually on his own terms because they were useful for him. That's why he read those languages in the translation form, and then he made very apt use of those bits of knowledge that he gleaned from there, and those are scattered all over Shakespeare's writing. But Shakespeare was at best a European genius. He wasn't available to us. So I would believe that, well, he appeals to us today, and in that sense, he is a part of the tradition that is spread all over the world, and so he can qualify for being a member of world literature. But he's not available to us till the 19th century in India. In the 18th century, very few would have heard of Shakespeare, maybe a few scholars, but others didn't know. And in fact, what I say is, maybe I'm wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong, till the 19th century, we don't think of world literature. There are translations that at that time being done. In the 18th century, there are English translations of Indian texts and vice versa. But then the larger, Indian population has no idea about what's going on in other countries at that point of time. So what does world literature mean to me then? What kind of, I think, I agree that there's a lot of sense in saying that writing was all the time appealing to the human beings in some form or the other, but I call it that not the kind of world literature that we, understand the term today, but they were universalist in nature. So naturally, you can go across in time and space, and you can go to another country and you can read their folk tales, you can read their music and other traditions and their theater, and then that appeals to you and you start appreciating it, and you feel a kind of joy reading those things. But then Is that world literature? Please ask this question from yourselves, and I have asked this question from myself also. That it is a part of the tradition that finally moves and integrates the world and moves towards a kind of unification. But then, per se, by nature, the tales, the dramas, the poems are not addressed to the world as such. They are addressed only to the specific cultures where they are born and they are produced. And I'm raising this. I'm not answering this question, but I'm saying that these are the questions that we face when we talk about world literature. So keep that in mind. So there is a kind of comprehension. And the second thing that most of the academics today would say is that well, you collect literatures from different areas, you get those books translated. But let me tell you that translation project is a big project in the academic world, and particularly in the Western world, has started only in the latter half of the 20th century. Before that, translation was not done on that kind of a scale on which it has emerged today. I shared this with another audience in Delhi University, and I was saying that till 1990, people had not talked about translation as a big project. In India, for instance, Shakespeare is available in Hindi translation, for instance, in the 1940s and 50s. And of course, in the 19th century also, there are some translations. I have read a few. There's a very early writer in Hindi, in the 19th century. And he has written a novel, and he is much before Premchand. And he gives the verse translation of some of the poems that Shakespeare wrote. But that is all. And people, read Shakespeare then, of course. But then, till the 19th century, till the 20th century, not many had taken the kind of interest that they did at that point of time. Tagore is one exception. Maybe Bankim Chandra would have done. Maybe Sarasan Chattopadhyay would have done. Maybe some Hindi writers also would have done in the early part of the 20th century. But so far as a comprehensive understanding of literature of that time is concerned, the translation is just not there. And the first translators on a big scale that appear in India in the early 20th century are those who are involved in the national movement. And in the national movement, they were actually trying to educate themselves. I know what Sarojini Naidu writing and reading towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. So she is reading. She is also using that knowledge for her writing. But then apart from that, Indian languages have their own interest now, their own curiosity about English and French literature, and they are translating that. Let me tell you a very good point of interest that the first reading of Tolstoy for me was in Hindi, and because he's available in Hindi translation. I read that novel I think sometime in 1960, and the translation was Yuddha Aur Shanti. And then, I became curious, and I had, at that moment of time, also had this capability to understand things in English. So I also looked for the English translation, which is also the translation of Tolstoy. It was Russian, was not known. So we were translating from translated texts, but then we were doing it. So that is the kind of, national movement, I think, required us to integrate here in India one region with another region, and for that, a kind of common language and common fund of literature had to be made available. So most of the nationalist writers and nationalist masses and nationalist readers, they promoted the idea of at least a national need to understand works from other countries. So please consider this point. And unless nationalism is strengthened in the 18th century onwards, internationalism doesn't appear. But nationalism was there, I think, in England. It was there in the 17th century. Queen Elizabeth, and before that, her grandfather, they were there, Henry VIII, and they made England a very strong country. But till that happened, translations into English, the Bible, were rarely available. And Bible, the first proper translation of Bible into English is, I think, early 17th century, when King James's version, is made available to the people. Before that, even Bible is not known. And King James was himself a great promoter of literature, and he created a kind of project, and he called the best minds from Europe to translate, the Bible into English. And you know that Bible is a kind of model for simplicity, model for communication, and model for appealing to the reader. So I say that translation has done this, but then bringing languages together is only one aspect of world literature, not the other aspect. And my contention is that world literature will appear on the scene only when the world is integrated. And the world is not integrated. It is divided, in nationalities, rightly. Nationalities also, freed us from the grip of feudalism. Till the feudal lords were there was no nationalism at all. So nationalism also is a historical development, and it appears only in the 18th or 19th centuries in Europe. And here nationalism is there, I think, in the latter half of the Mughal period, when India, starts calling itself India. But then the proper nationalism, even for us, comes only towards the end of the 19th century. Then, we have the national movement, and then India starts becoming one. Before that, India is divided into, different regions, and there is a regionalism even today. But then it became a big force in the 19th century, and it was because of that, that we were able to oust the imperialistic powers stationed here. So I say that nationalism served a very good historical purpose, at the level of the world also. But then, when do the World War appear? The First World War appears in 1914. Before that, you have wars between countries, but there's no World War. So what does World War mean? It's totally different, qualitatively different from the normal wars earlier. Earlier, there would be a war between regions in different countries. There were wars in England, there were wars in Africa, there were wars, and the wars, under colonialism, they were there, but then they were between nations, or they were between regions. And in India, for instance, they were between one ruler and another in the states. But when World War occurs, then, the world is disintegrated and integrated. Integrated because then you have a whole group of nations fighting a war which is destructive for all. And that destruction, wakes us up. And then we realize that I think we require a world body which will fight the fissiparous tendencies in the world, and will create a world which is without the war, which is a peaceable world. So after the First World War, the world starts thinking of a kind of United Nations body. I don't know exactly what was there at that time, but then people started thinking of avoiding that war by getting together. So that, I think, is the essence of the world, that the world wants to protect itself, and it would like now to apply its mind to the preservation of humanity on this planet on terms of equality, on terms of freedom, on terms of justice. So that's how it begins. The second point that I make is that apart from this nationalism and history, there's another feature that's to be kept in mind, and that is, the production of goods. Professor Satyanath talks about agriculture. This is a very important point, in the study of folklore, in the study of world literature. Yes, agriculture means agricultural production. And when agricultural production is on a bigger scale than before, then, you start needing implements, you start needing a new machine. And wherever the design of the machine is available, you'll get it from there. You will send your own people to the other country to gain knowledge of the technology available at that place. And those people will rush to you to gain knowledge from what you have done in your country, what I have done in my country. So in a way, so far as the rest of the world is concerned, outside Europe, I would say they start experimenting with getting together. In India, for instance, in the early medieval period, in the 13th, 14th centuries, and when the Bhakti movement in India starts. Now, Bhakti poets, even though they belong to Rajasthan, they belong to Kashmir, they belong to the Deccan, they talk about humanity, and they talk about love, and love, joined these communities together. Otherwise, there would have been no India at that time, and India had emerged, in a seed form in the medieval period. And in the 19th century, when you have a common enemy, then you have to unite. And when you unite, then you become a whole India. And if there's a common enemy in the destruction through technology by people, who gain to, have to gain from destruction, then you identify them. And then you say that they are in fact the enemies of the world. And therefore you say, let the world also now unite to fight these enemies. And the idea of a world thing, this world is very important. Now just see that when the production is kept in mind, then you have, for instance, in the industrial development, and the industrial revolution occurs in 1820 or so. Before that, things are being produced by artisans, and there is no industry. But then, in the 19th century, you have big industrial units coming up in England and later on in America also in the early 20th century. And then, you realize that raw material has to be got from anywhere. So if you require that raw material from another country, you will send your people there. If they have to require technology from you, they will come here. And this kind of interaction. And finally, the point I start making about this, when industrial goods are produced, who produces them? Not artisans. There are people who assemble around a machine, and they may be in hundreds, if not more, and they work together separately, splitting the product into parts, producing those parts, and then getting them together. So how many people are involved when a car is produced in the early 20th century? And how many are together, when even bigger things, a machine is produced, machine producing machines. This is a new kind of technology, and that occurs in the 20th century itself. So when machines start producing machines, then you have universities coming up, and then you have science departments, and science also split into so many different disciplines. And there's physics, and then there's chemistry, and then there's engineering, and then there's technology, then there's manufacture, all those things. And then just imagine how many people have got together in the production of a good. I think it will be thousands at that point of time. And these 1,000 people, do you say that one is black and the other is white? And that this is a car produced by a white person, and another car that is produced by a yellow person, Chinese, for instance? No. Or a woman or a man. All people become workers. And these workers, have a category. Workers basically are symbols of human labor. And when workers are there, I think we also are intellectual workers here, intellect workers. We produce knowledge in the universities, and through that knowledge we are together. And when knowledge becomes this kind of industry, then we straight away relate to people in other universities in other parts of the world. So a kind of world culture develops only with industrialism, with expanded capital, with expanded production, and then you become, in a way, an integrated world at the level of production. So this new kind of unit in the human society, which doesn't bother about whether it's a woman or a man, whether it's a black or a white, whether it's a young person or an old person, or a person of 20 or a person of 60. You don't make these distinctions. What you want is what is useful for the society as a whole. So that is where the world is unified and becomes one. And when that is one, they require literature also. They require what is called world literature. So I believe that world literature is produced at a time when the world is unified, when the world is integrated, and when it has a vision at the level of production, at the level of give and take. And so many marriages are happening, interfaith marriages, intercultural marriages, they're taking place, and straight away we become international. And I think the first, very important, announcement was done by no other than Karl Marx, who said in that famous Communist Manifesto, the last line is, workers of the world unite. He doesn't say workers of India or Germany or France unite. And there are ironies about his life. I keep telling people that he had the whole world to himself, but he had not a single country which would give him protection. He could not live in Germany, where he was born. He could not live in France, where he was read. He could not go anywhere, and everywhere he was a suspect. And finally, on English terms, he was invited by friends in England to come and stay there. But the condition was there that he will only study. He said, okay, I'll study. And all the time he was using the library. And in the library, through library, he was in touch with the whole world. So imagine a person who wants to define humanity as worker, And that worker who is a world citizen, that person has no country. Even literally, he has no country. He can't belong to one country or the other. But therefore, he's more, loyal to and more aligned to the library. And library is the place where, he'll produce his kind of knowledge. And from 1860 onwards, I think till his death in 1880 or so, he will always remain in the library because his kind of dream could not be easily fulfilled. The world at that time didn't want to be, very protective and very useful and positive kind of place. It wanted to be competitive, and in competition there would be profit and there would be loss, but there would be no gainful thing happening at the level of human level. So therefore, you have this, and I would end my discussion with this, that in the 20th century there is a kind of world literature which is not there till that time. For instance, who do you say that Pablo Neruda is a Chilean poet? People don't even know where is Chile and what is the language of Chile. And I'm still confused, even though I've taught Pablo Neruda. I still think that when the Spanish, he writes in Spanish, which Spanish is this? Has he inherited from Spain, or has he learned his Spain, Spanish from the country of his origin? And Marquez, he writes in Spanish, and all of us can only read him in English because we know English here. And who are his readers? His readers are not people of his own country or the speakers or people who know his own language. His readers are all over the world. I have not read much extensively this person, but I believe that he addresses the entire population in the world. So that is world literature. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, he's an Urdu poet. He was born in colonial India, and and the moment people become free, and he has to be ousted from Pakistan, and he comes to India, and on condition that India has to offer. Then he goes to other countries, he goes to Russia, he stays for some time there. So I say he's an international citizen, but he doesn't belong to his own language. So he's a world poet. He's a poet of the world literature because he is a poet who belongs to an integrated humanity at the level of dreams. And writers are very important today. Professor Nandini Sahu herself is a writer. I would say that she is not addressing mainly women. She's not addressing mainly people of a particular region. She is writing only about herself, and she is integrated into the world that I call the citizens of the world. So this is what is world literature, and this category has come at a time when production has become integrated. When you have coffee, which is where the coffee has come from somewhere else, and the sugar comes from another country, and milk is produced elsewhere, and all the utensils in the kitchen are the kitchen is an international place today. The kitchen is not an Indian kitchen anymore today. Even the Indian bathroom is not the Indian. It has lots of things which are imported from other countries, and it's a very sophisticated place now. So what I say is that the world has this kind of a character that it is integrated, that it where the different parts are vitally connected with one another. That is what is important today, and therefore writing, literature. Where does one get one's inspiration from? Now a war is taking place elsewhere, and people are being suppressed, or they're attacking others and killing them, and we are concerned here. Why? And therefore we write about the atrocities of war, and all of us writers particularly, they are internationalists today. So they want peace, they want justice, they want equality, they want dignity, and that is what is world literature. And this kind of ideal that the writers espouse today, those ideas are not there till the 19th century. So national movements come, then revolutions occur, then there is a general kind of inertia at some places, and dynamism at another. That is there, and people wake up and they don't have dreams, but they have nightmares, and those nightmares tell them that the world has to be protected. All that is important, and this is what I think makes us believe that today is the day, or 20th century is the century when world wars occur, and now we are afraid of the world wars because we want to protect the world. You don't want to protect myself or yourself. You want to protect the humanity at this point of time. Where would children go? How would they be studying things? Do they require schools and colleges? Do they require libraries and laboratories? These are our concerns, and they are world concerns. And world cannot survive if you think only in terms of regions. So I conclude my lecture by saying that these are the places which can't live without one another, and they have to be together. And therefore, and I would finish this with a statement that I just put it down. I say, for instance, in the case of Renaissance, I say the catchwords of Renaissance were temporal power, not divine power. They were temporal power. They were kings, and they were in touch. They were in touch with a different kind of religion, not Roman Catholicism, particularly in England. The human body. Now, mostly human body is Maya, and only Renaissance said no, human body is not Maya. Human body is a living thing. You can touch, you can sense, you can smell, you can be with it, and you can get from human body you can get a different kind of pleasure. The beauty of nature. Nobody addressed nature the way romantics do, in the latter part of the 19th century. So individual worth, love for freedom, these are the ideas of Renaissance, and it is these that pave the way for modern kind of thinking, and that takes us into the 20th century world concept. So I say, and I'm raising these questions, I'm not giving answers. I say that the word world literature is to be redefined in terms of individuality, in terms of imagining the world as one and indivisible. So, and humanity, let me tell you, that's my feeling, and that's the feeling I believe of all the right thinking, writers. Humanity is one and indivisible. Color, that doesn't separate it. Height or features don't separate it. It is humanity. It can, if it doesn't speak one language, it can learn it tomorrow, and it can become that. So think of this unity. Think of the kind of justice that is there in meeting of equals, men or women, African or Indian, or things like that. And then you have the proper firmer ground of sustenance on this planet as human beings. And let me repeat, human beings, humanity are one and indivisible. That's the motto, in fact, of world literature. So let's go by that, and I hope that you will give some thought to this and get back and tell me whether I'm making sense. Thank you.
Well, Paramita, may I?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We are waiting for your valuable comments and your thoughts.
Before we take questions from our teachers and students, okay. So, Professor Anand Prakash, uh, we all are very inspired by what you talked about. You actually redefined the spirit of this lecture series. You informed us that in a unified and integrated world, we need more of world literature, we need more of comparative world literature. That is the literature of dignity and freedom and integrity. That was your spirit. But very nicely, you took over from Professor Satyanath when he talked about folklore. And then you took the spirit from him. You started with marginal studies and folk literature and tribal studies. And then slowly you went to give us a very, very comprehensive view of world literature, the literature of dignity, freedom, and integrity. And then you raised questions about world literature, and you asked questions to yourself and also to us. Very clever questions, which you said, I will not answer, but you ended up answering to all the questions that you asked. At least I got the answers. You questioned if the poems are not addressed to the integrated world but to specific cultures, then shall we call it world literature? If any poet writes about any specific culture and not about an integrated world, it's a big question about comparative world literature that we will take up in our courses. And very beautifully, you referred to Sarachandra Chattopadhyay, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and Neruda in equal terms. How nicely you created a parallel between these three writers from very, very different cultures and regions, and then you created some uniform sensibility, some imagination about the three writers together. And you referred to Indian languages and world literature, Bhakti movement and world literature, very, very wide range of subjects that you have taken. Then ethics of translation, very interesting. We have a translation studies department. Our teachers are doing excellent work in the translation studies department, and our students also, they're very well placed. Once they pass out from our MA in translation studies, they are placed in very important institutions as official translators. I will give details to you after this lecture. And then war literature, how war literature is a part of world literature, I never thought about it. Now I'm going to think about it more. And then somehow you referred to green studies, blue humanities, and ocean studies. These are interesting areas of research and pedagogy coming up. Even Professor Satyanath talked about agriculture and green culture and ocean humanities, and then you somehow referred to them in different contexts. So based on the lecture that you delivered, I ended up questioning a few things to myself, which I will put as a part of our experts committee meetings when we design our comparative world literatures courses, the programs, MA programs. And the questions, please allow me to put the questions to all of us here so that we can answer to them when we design our MA courses. The first question that I got from your lecture is, how does the concept of world literature challenge Eurocentrism in literary studies? When you talked about Chaucer and the humor that he uses, I jotted down this question. And then another question for our research is, what role does translation play in shaping the reception and interpretation of texts in world literature? That is another question. Then the third question that I can ask myself is, how do global literary circulations and publishing networks influence texts that become canonical or otherwise in world literature? Which is a canonical text and which is not? That is a very, very interesting question. And then, what are the ethical and political implications of adapting non Western literary traditions into global literary frameworks? In a university in West Bengal, where Bengali literature and other Bhasha literatures are so very important, where do we place our canonical and non canonical texts? And then, how does world literature engage with issues of migration, displacement, and diaspora in the 21st century? And the other question is, in what ways does world literature intersect with post colonial studies, and how do these fields inform each other? Interdisciplinary way, they inform each other. That was one question I took from your lecture. And then, how do the indigenous literary traditions challenge and redefine the boundaries of world literature? And then the other question is, what is the impact of digital technology? You referred to a lot of technology, which was good and interesting. How do contemporary world, how do what is the impact of digital technology, social media, and artificial intelligence on the production and consumption of world literature? Our students are too much into artificial intelligence, into technology. So how do we inform them about world literature? They can take something from WhatsApp and then they can claim that this is world literature. So how do we problematize that? How do we address that is another important question. And then how do contemporary world literary texts address global crises such as climate change, war, human rights violations? That is one. And the last question is, to what extent do world literature anthologies and curricula that reflect a truly diverse and representative selection of the global voices? These are very critical and important questions that I found from your lecture. I'm going to discuss all of them with you, and maybe we can get to some conclusion so that we can frame our MA programs in comparative world literature department in a more fruitful and in a more theoretical and very, very textual way, and we can address the need of the hour. With this, I'll stop here and pass it on to Paramita. If the students have questions or the teachers have questions, two eminent speakers are here. They can talk to them. Yeah, thank you, Paramita.
Thank you, ma'am.
And thank you, Professor Anand and Professor Satyanath. So important and interesting lectures. We are going to do the YouTube soon.
Thank you, ma'am. If anyone have any questions, please feel free to ask. Okay. So
Yes, ma'am.
yes, yes, ma'am. Please, you may ask.
नमस्ते मैम। नमस्ते सर। मेरा एक प्रश्न है आप लोग से कि पाश्चात्य विचारक जो है मैक्स मूलर, उन्होंने कहा है कि ऑल हायर नॉलेज इज गैनेड बाय कंपैरिजन एंड रेस्टेस ऑन कंपैरिजन। क्या सभी उच्चतर ज्ञान की प्राप्ति हमें तुलना से हुई है और वो तुलना पर ही आधारित है? तो सर ये किस तरह से, एक बार इसको स्पष्ट कीजिए।
Yes, yes, I think it makes sense because unless you compare and you contrast, you don't get clarity regarding the issues, and that's what the purpose of literature has been even earlier. That you read writers who don't agree with you. There are feminist writers today. Maybe most of the males would always look at feminist writing as inferior writing, restricted to the home and all those things. But then you read that writing and then you realize that maybe I'm not, for instance, that I didn't know about many aspects of, the world that had entered the home, and the woman knew it. So Max Muller is right there that, it expands your mental horizon, it expands my mental horizon, and that after reading a few things that don't come near me earlier, those things transform me completely. And that's how uh, learning begins. We are all teachers, we are all scholars, and we always are surrounded by those who question us, and that enriches our understanding. So this is what literature does. Literature holds the mirror up to me. I mean, I'm quoting Dr. Johnson, that you hold a mirror up to yourself or to society, and then society sees its ills and evils reflected there, and then it starts correcting itself. That's the purpose of writing, and that's the purpose of reading. So I totally agree with you on this quotation from Max Muller, that with comparison, you have a different kind of comprehension about the reality. Thank you.
ओके सर, थैंक यू सर।
Thank you so much, sir. Now, I think, yes, Dr. Payal Nagpal.
Yes, thank you, Paromita. Thank you, Professor Sahu, for organizing this, and thank you, Professor Prakash and Professor Satyanath, for such a wonderful insights into this very, very rich area. I had a question for Professor Prakash, that while we talk about world literature as a category, that's like you said, that it's something that develops in a sense in the 20th century. Uh, how do you think it is important to maintain a certain kind of balance between world literature as something that surpasses borders, and you've given several examples there, and at the same time it becomes important to look at that humanitarian perspective also in terms of the specificity of the context from which the writer is emerging, and the concerns that the writer is throwing light on. So, I also had in mind what Professor Satyanath said about, the movement, for instance, of the Panchatantra and of texts before that, to different countries. So, how do you think it's that somewhere we also need to have that, maybe keep a balance in mind in the context of world literature?
Well, if I have to respond to the question, while I would say that yes, the reality is one, but it has many parts, and that so far, we have been putting the parts against the whole. The idea is to understand the whole in the study of the part. I mean, I'm being a little philosophical, but this part contains the entire thing. And Whitman said it, in the 19th century itself, I contain the universe. So it was just an individual, and an individual who was writing in America, and then he said, "I'm the universe." So parts, have to be seen not as I would, use another word, not balance. Balance is a very typical, shopkeeper's kind of implement, that you balance one with the other. Balance will not do. It has to be right or wrong, and it can be less wrong or more wrong. That is important. But finally, these parts, have to reflect the entirety of the thing, and vice versa. That there has to be a kind of concentration of the whole in the part. So it's a slightly different kind of a understanding of society. Let's not divide things into parts and then put them together. Let's see the whole in the part and vice versa. So, while I think you raised this question, and I'll think more about it. I'm just responding on the basis of the straight answer at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prakash.
Thank you.
If I just react to the previous 2-3 questions, the problem that I see is both comparative literature and world literature, the terms have been constantly changing in the last 60, 70 years. And the context, for example, when comparative literature came into existence in in the 1970s, it was introduced as a discipline, and a robust curriculum was developed in America. What was thought of world literature at that time and the texts that were put together is very much different from the comparative world literature that we have talking with reference to David Damrosch in 2004. And it's very much different from the type of world literature that we are talking now. Now, you see, if you look at the English canon, then you cannot have a world literature of the English canon with multiple languages and in a country like India where multiple languages are spoken. And also, the many writers defined their own world literature. For example, Kuempu defines one. The Hindi writers, they define one, and the Arab Indian English writers define their own. So the definition as well as the canon that is in discussion at any particular point of time as world literature is constantly changing. And for example, for Kuempu, he is talking of 14 or 15 Indian and the Persian writers, including Aurobindo, who is the modern Indian writer, as his models in writing a Ramayana in 20th century. So, what you see, coming to our own Indian languages, probably each Indian language has a world literature canon, however poor it might be, which is much bigger than the Indian English literature canon that we have read or we have looked at it. So the instead of a pyramid, you have an inverted pyramid where the regional language canon stands much more important for that particular language, readers of that particular language. So I think, and it is because of this reason, the comparative literature ever since 1969 has constantly gone into a contest. That means, is comparative literature possible? This started from René Velac writing in 1969 as Crisis in Comparative Literature. And the 6 or 7 reports that have appeared in every 10 years by the International Comparative Literature report says comparative literature is going to die in the next few years. The recent 2024 says in next 10 years, comparative literature will not be there on the scene. But look at India. The comparative literature departments and the world literature canon in the Indian languages have constantly is on the increase. So what the world literature and the comparative literature report predicted for the entire world, hoping that they were not predicting it for the entire world. They were with the location of the United States and Europe, what they were predicting was actually not true. And scholars have observed that Indian universities are doing more comparative literature now, despite their single language departments or department of comparative literature. A majority of the English departments have changed into Department of English and Comparative Literature. And in English department department, you are seeing the popular literature being studied, folk literature is being studied. One of the theses that I evaluated from the Department of English, Bangalore, is on the publication of pocket books, Hindi pocket books from the road, the Bangalore Road, where it was that was the center of publication activity in the 1960s and 70s. How it moved to Wazirpur industrial estate, after a few years, and now the pocket books have virtually disappeared. And the people who took part in that were not conversant with the language. They couldn't read the script. binders, composers, or rather living composers, printers, and other people who are Muslims who couldn't read the Hindi pocket books that were being produced for the people. So the nature of the study of comparative literature and world literature is radically changed. We keep certain post-colonial guide marks called the maybe margin identity, probably women feminist studies, LGBT studies. These are some of the identities that are being contesting, and we are trying to focus mostly on that. But if you just cross them and go a little beyond that, probably we have much more interesting and probably more relevant and more working about the binders of popular pocket books is not a very simple thing. I couldn't imagine that. I was wonderstruck by when I evaluated that thesis. So I think the area that in the regions, or what we call the areas that we have is probably still not explored properly. And I hope that the Indian both as far as translation is concerned and comparative literature is concerned, the topics and the areas are still very open, and there is a lot that is waiting to be explored.
Yeah, yes, Professor Satyanath and Professor Anand Prakash, you will definitely agree with me when I say that comparative literature and comparative world literature kind of topics, research areas can be popularized more if we introduce them as a part of our syllabus. If we are giving those to the students to read as a part of their syllabus and their UGC net examinations and then their profession, if we are able to create that kind of a platform. We have two scholars here, Dr. Durjati and Dr. Mrudusmita. They have contributed extensively to the MA in Folk Literature program that we had designed, and the program MA in Folk Literature, there are 15,000 students which we designed. Professor Satyanath has contributed, and then Dr. Durjati and Mrudusmita, they have raised hands. Maybe they want to give some comments. So Paramita, please allow Dr. Durjati and Dr. Mrudusmita, after which maybe you can conclude.
Yes, sure, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Actually, unfortunately, due to paucity of time, we will be able to take two more questions from Dhrujyoti Sharma and Mridusmita Barua. And after that, if anyone have any questions, please send us. We will love to send it to our speakers. Thank you. Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
Mr. Dhrujyoti Sharma.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes. First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure and privilege to attend this lecture because both Professor Satyanath sir and Professor Anand Prakash sir were my teachers during my master's and MPhil days. So it's a really a matter of great pleasure and honor for me to be here. So I, have been always learning from Professor Satyanath sir. And so, sir, I just had a curiosity. This is something that I myself have been addressing. Sir, about this whole idea of, can you talk something about, retextualization? Because even various folk cultures, when they've existed, within the oral performative domain, they have sort of, in the context of colonial modernity and also within the nationalist project, many of these works have emerged as part of the textual corpus. And this also leads to a kind of a standardization, of them as being like one version of a folk tale being sort of given the primacy over, other competing narratives. So, I mean, how do you place this kind of a textualization vis-a-vis, the corpus of world literature? I mean, vis-a-vis other narratives of similar, order, which have not been textualized, but one version gets sort of priority, vis-a-vis the other because that version got published as one of the authorized versions.
It all depends on how we look at it.
Yes.
I would look at it from the other perspective. How
Okay.
did the public, public, public sphere, I will use it, the public, most of them were not aware of the written version or were not in a position to read the written version. Let's take a tribal culture where there is no script, and then somehow it is put into script or translated into English or whatever, or Hindi or whatever you call.
Right.
What how serious it is a matter for the public sphere? I think, I would look at it from that perspective.
Right, sir.
So public sphere is already aware of multiple versions, according to me, because each singer has his own version. To be very loose definitionally, each singer has his own version. Although he has a tradition, he has a singer from whom he learns, and then he also introduces himself. So let us roughly take but the audience are fairly comfortable with these multiple versions. So it's quite possible that the culture, quote and unquote, if you want to call it Indian culture is fairly familiar and is capable of handling variation.
Right, sir.
And the fixation that takes place either with an old text, say Ramayana, or with a transcribed and published text, probably will not bother the public sphere to an extent that it bothers an academic exercise or an academic scholar like you and me. If you look at it from that point of view, variation or the fixation of the variation through printed text is not a very big matter. But if you look at it from the point of view of what a text does, suppose, I have seen cases where such printed texts are being performed. I also see the other possibility. In Kannada, we have several examples where the oral text went into print form. The print text got into the oral form again, that was sung, and then that got into an cassette culture, and that got into a video culture. So the process probably never is complete in a living culture. It keeps so in these oscillations, what happens is a very interesting thing. The music might change, which I consider as the most important thing in a folk culture. I can consider the sonosphere of the music is the most crucial thing.
Right, sir.
But there are occasions where even that might get disturbed, that might get altered. So I think in living cultures, these flows, variations, changes, resettlement, that's part of the living activity of such cultures. I wouldn't personally worry much about that, except that I would like to observe it and probably learn from that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now, Mridusmita Barua, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Nandini ma'am, for this wonderful, webinar. And I'm just taking a lot of, knowledge from this exceptional webinar. Thank you, the eminent speakers. I have observation actually. When we are in and digital arrest and the Star Wars happening, we are somewhere. We are. Don't we think? Don't we feel that we are living in a utopia when we talk about an integrated humanity? A poet who tries to write, a poet who is a victim.
Ma'am, we can't hear you, ma'am. Yes. No, it's fine.
Am I audible?
No, yes, ma'am. It's nice.
I just have a slight discomfort in this matter when a writer is stuck between periphery and mainstream, when she or he is trying to, kind of address the issues faced, in a particular state. How can we, talk of world literature as an integrated form of literature? Aren't we addressing, that audience itself? And when we are talking about artificial intelligence and digital arrest kind of a situation, are we not, going to a position where folklore has gone into oblivion? I may be incorrect, I may be wrong, but this was my small observation. Thank you.
Okay, before any one of the speakers takes up
I think,
this
I will just
question,
respond to this.
yes, yes. So I would
This
rather
is,
say
this
Professor
is
Satyanath
exactly
sir.
the history. The dismay that you are showing is actually the history of folklore. See, phonograph was invented sometime towards the end of 1880s, 1882 or something, and the microphone was introduced. So vinyl discs started appearing towards the beginning of the 20th century. We have recorded material of folklore from that point onwards. What the most interesting that happened is the folklore is available for us for comparison today. Otherwise, if none of these tools were available, I should have done the comparative folklore of two singers singing the same narrative. Now that has incorporated a temporal dimension. And there is a big American project called the Cantrometric study. They have collected the folk songs all over the world. Arnold Bocke, a Danish anthropologist, visited India exactly 100 years, and exactly 100 years back, he has recorded the first digital format of Indian folklore. Now, we should be celebrating this rather than probably feeling a problem with that. The data that is available, whether it is on the temporal axis, spatial axis, or the hierarchical axis, like caste and other, gender axis, these things should be actually an offer for a feast for a comparative scholar. So I don't personally feel that any of these things that is happening, and I'm sure in the next few years artificial intelligence is going to take over this place of this research scholar, and probably will provide you half the data ready, like the PowerPoint presentation before 2002 2003 was absolutely out of fashion. But PowerPoint presentation as a part of our presentation, whether you are talking literature or you are talking folklore, has become an integral part of Indian academy. So I believe any challenge, or any new invention, technology is a challenge for research and is a challenge for the research. How we negotiate and how we will be able to negotiate it, it will have its own positive and negative sides, but how it is negotiated is going to be, one has to wait. And you can already see it happening. People have moved over to social media for their research. They don't, some of my friends complain that they don't go and collect the data anymore. It's easily available on the social media. They will pick it up and do some study. So I think um, everything has its own positive and negative things. And I, as a scholar who almost retired 15 years back, I'm still optimistic.
Right, sir.
Thank you.
Please conclude, Paramita.
Yes, thank you, sir. I would like to thank Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, today's eminent speakers, Professor T.S. Satyanath, sir, and Dr. Anand Prakash, sir, and all the participants for joining us today. Thank you. You made a great success and you made this webinar successful. Thank you so much.